حفظ القيادة السورية على أرواح مواطنينا وأمن بلدنا.
Assad does not have significant military capability.
إذا قتلونا مع بلادنا نروح على بلادنا.
Good afternoon. It is Thursday, September 12th. I'm Yumna Naufal, and these are today's headlines. Kerry's in Geneva to meet Lavrov to discuss how the UN can secure and destroy Assad's chemical weapons. Russian President Vladimir Putin writes in the New York Times warning a military strike could unleash a new wave of terrorism. And President Michel Sleiman defends the Babda Declaration, a pact signed by rival political leaders to distance Lebanon from the Syrian crisis. The rebel-free Syrian army has rejected the Russian proposal for placing Syria's chemical arms under international control, questioning the initiative and saying it is a political maneuver aimed at buying time for the regime of President Bashar al-Assad. FSA military commander General Salim Idris told world powers they should judge the author of the crime before the International Criminal Court, who has clearly acknowledged possessing it and agreed to get rid of it. Washington is calling on Syria to declare the scope and size of its chemical weapons stockpile as U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry arrives in Geneva to meet Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov, and the UN tries to forge an international plan to disarm the Syrian government of its chemical weapons. Lavrov and Kerry are expected to discuss efforts to agree on a UN resolution on the issue, as well as the practicalities of finding, removing, and destroying chemical stockpiles. Russia on Monday announced a proposal under which Syria would turn over its chemical weapons, and U.S. President Barack Obama postponed any military action to consider the Russian initiative. The four-point plan, details of which were disclosed on Wednesday, would see Syria becoming a member of the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. Russian President Vladimir Putin addressed the American people and U.S. politicians on Syria by writing an article in the New York Times warning that a military strike could unleash a new wave of terrorism. Writing in the newspaper on Thursday, Putin said there are more than enough Qaeda fighters and extremists of all types battling the government. He added that millions around the world increasingly see America not as a model of democracy, but as it relying solely on brute force, cobbling coalitions together under the slogan, "You're either with us or against us." Putin said it was alarming that intervening militarily in foreign countries and internal conflicts had become commonplace for the United States. And he also rejected Obama's assertion of American exceptionalism, saying it is extremely dangerous to encourage people to see themselves as exceptional. United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon took the UN and its member states to task for failing to act to prevent mass atrocities in Syria. The UN chief was speaking at an event called The Responsibility to Protect, held at the UN headquarters in New York. UN rights investigators, meanwhile, have established that Syrian government forces were almost certainly responsible for two massacres last May, in which up to 450 civilians were killed. The report documents 9 mass killings in all, attributing all but one to government forces, but said both government and rebel fighters had committed war crimes, including murder, hostage-taking, and shelling of civilians.
Collective failure to prevent atrocity crimes in Syria over the past 2.5 years will remain a heavy burden on the standing of the United Nations and its member states. I hope that the current discussions related to safeguarding Syria's chemical weapon stocks will lead to the Security Council playing an effective role in promoting an end to the Syrian tragedy.
We pay an enormous price for waiting for conflicts to get worse. The Syria example is, I think, the most striking now, but you can see it all over the world. In my own experience dealing with humanitarian crisis and conflicts, it is, you come in like a fireman after the fire, when you indeed should have been there when the smoke develops, or even better, when the arsonist reaches for the match. So the early prevention is the absolutely most crucial thing to think about.
Coming up next, we're talking and we're seeing with Dr. Vijay Prashaf, who's in our studios. We're going to discuss more about Syria. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back. In our studios to discuss the recent developments on Syria is Dr. Vijay Prashad, the Professor of American Studies at the American University of Beirut. Welcome, Vijay. What can we expect from the meeting between U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry and Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov?
Well, it's an important meeting, and I very much hope that the Russians and the Americans come to some understanding. I think that there was a catapulting of foreign policy diplomacy when the United States set a red line, was unable to meet the red line because it couldn't convince the majority of the world of the, perhaps you might say, of their claim, their argument. And they were sort of trapped by their red line rhetoric. The Russians and the Syrians have come up with some kind of face-saving maneuver for the American government. And I think that is the reason why they're in Geneva. The problem actually isn't the meeting in Geneva. It's that sections of the American establishment, the British and the French, are eager to put a UN Security Council resolution alongside this agreement on chemical weapons with the Syrians and the Russians. And unfortunately, here the writing is going to be a little sticky, because the West wants a resolution under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, which neither the Russians nor the Chinese will allow, because that gives an open invitation to the West for a military strike at any possible time.
I know that you wrote a specific article saying that you were, you're obviously anti-Assad, but you were also against a strike. Can you tell me why?
Well, military interventions of the kind that the United States has done since Libya, before that Iraq, haven't turned out very well. These are great political conflicts that are going on, for instance, that had been going on in Iraq. And the American strike produced a certain kind of grammar of political life in Iraq, which has led to increasing and deep sectarianism. And I fear that this kind of military strike posture that the United States has at its disposal, where you aerial bomb, where you hope that your allies come to power, where you rip apart a country socially, even more than it's ripped apart previously, this has not turned out very well. The most recent example of this was Libya. So I fear that the US government's approach to international conflict has actually, is anachronistic. It's no longer valuable. And therefore, I think it's a very bad idea to rely on American strikes, which are often from the air, which are not calibrated properly to the politics on the ground, and which end up creating a humanitarian disaster.
Well, according to the Washington Post, the CIA has begun delivering weapons to rebels in Syria, ending the month of delay in lethal aid that had been promised by the Obama administration, according to U.S. officials and Syrian figures. So now that these weapons have started to come through, isn't this tipping the balance, which is what they said the strike was going to be about in the first place, mentioning that they were not going and they were going to ensure that the regime is not removed?
Well, I mean, I'm sorry to break the news to people in this region, but the United States is actually not interested in removing the Assad regime. In his most recent speech, the President of the United States, Mr. Obama, said that you cannot remove dictators with force. That's an incredible admission by the Obama administration. They have said repeatedly that they are not going to provide sufficient arms to overthrow the regime. In fact, during this threat of military strike...
So is that why you think there's been a delay in the arms getting to the rebels? Because they're also a little bit on the fence about whether or not to support the rebels who they think do not serve American interest, as Dempsey once said.
Well, I think that's true. I think they've made it very clear that they're cautious about the rebels. I think, again, the example of Libya is hanging like a very heavy shadow on their Syria policy. But frankly, I think neither the government in Tel Aviv nor the government in Washington, D.C. is keen to see Mr. Assad removed. I think what they would very much like is to see Syria bleed and Syria be destroyed. I think that is the reason they're going to provide just sufficient arms to continue the bloodshed. There are already over 100,000 people dead. Over 6 million people have been displaced from their homes. Syria is an international tragedy, and I fear that the strategy of the United States is simply to bleed the country further. That should be something that all sides who are participating in the conflict refuse to be a part of. You know, the embers of Syrian nationalism need to be revived. People need to think of the Syrian people first and not about the agendas of outside powers.
Okay, well, thank you so much for joining us. That was Dr. Vijay Prashad, the Professor of American Studies at the American University of Beirut.
Thank you.
In Lebanon, the Babda Palace statement says an agreement has been reached among the country's rival leaders last year to steer Lebanon clear of the region's crises, and that did not deal with the resistance arms. And that statement did not deal with what should have been paving the way for the discussion of the national defense strategy. Rival leaders from the March 8 and March 14 alliances affirmed on June 11, 2012, commitment to the Ta'if Accord and agreed specifically to keep Lebanon away from the policy of regional and international conflicts to spare it the negative repercussions of the regional crises. The document, President Sulaiman explained, presented ideas that were considered a springboard for discussion by the leaders of the national dialogue. Those ideas, he said in the statement, were to be discussed in subsequent meetings that have not yet taken place. The pact, according to the clarification, agreed on the need to take adherence seriously, supporting the Lebanese army and keeping Lebanon neutral from regional and international conflicts. Head of the Loyalty to the Resistance Bloc MP Mohammed Raed is accusing the Future Movement and some members of the March 14 alliance of creating incitement against Hezbollah over the security measures it has taken in and around its stronghold of Dahieh in Beirut's southern suburbs. He said in a statement their claims over the alleged autonomous security in Dahieh are part of an ongoing campaign against the resistance, its people and supporters. He declared the insiders are using all possible means against the resistance, including harboring some Takfiri terrorists who threatened the security of civilians. He therefore denied claims that Hezbollah is adopting autonomous security, saying, quote, "The noble citizens of Dahieh and other areas have repeatedly urged the state security forces to assume their duties in protecting them, but those demands have not yet been fulfilled." For news around the world in brief, fighting intensifies between Muslim rebels and government troops in the southern Philippines as a standoff reaches its fourth day. On Monday, hundreds of heavily armed Muslim gunmen landed in 5 coastal districts of Zamboanga and took 30 hostages. They had planned to march to the city hall to raise their flag and declare the area an independent state. Security forces exchanged gunfire and mortar rounds in the village of Santa Barbara early Thursday morning after troops captured the rebel positions, including a mosque where the hostages were earlier held. Russia says that North Korea is apparently conducting work on a nuclear reactor, saying the H facility was in such a nightmarish state it could cause a disaster. It is obvious that some works are being conducted, and for a long time at that, the Interfax news agency quoted diplomatic sources saying that according to some signs, steps were indeed being taken to relaunch it. Prince Harry says the winners of the 2013 Well Child Awards, which recognizes courageous youngsters, are unbelievably brave. The British royal is patron of the charity and was on hand to meet some of the children. The Well Child charity recognizes the courage of seriously ill children and young people, as well as the hard work of the doctors, nurses, and other health professionals who care for them. Speaking before handing out an award, the royal said it meant so much to see such bravery in the young ones because it reminds the world of all the things taken for granted. Among the children being honored was Madison Kirk, who has undergone surgery and months of chemotherapy treatment for anaplastic large cell lymphoma. She won an award in the Inspirational Child category, and she revealed that Harry told her that his new nephew, Prince George of Cambridge, had started smiling at him. This marks the end of our bulletin for today. Now for a reminder of our top stories. Harry's in Geneva to meet Lavrov to discuss how the UN can secure and destroy Assad's chemical weapons. Russian President Vladimir Putin writes in the New York Times warning a military strike could unleash a new wave of terrorism. And President Sulaiman defends the Babda Declaration, a pact signed by rival political leaders to distance Lebanon from the Syrian crisis. Those are your Thursday headlines live on Future Television in Beirut. I'm Yumna Naufal, wishing you all a good night.
من حرص القيادة السورية على أرواح مواطنينا وأمن بلدنا.
Assad does not have significant military capability.
إذا قتلونا مع اللبنان